Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
Picture this scenario unfolding in a stuffy lawyer's office tucked away in the heart of small-town Iowa, where the air hangs heavy with the lingering aroma of stale coffee mixed with the subtle undercurrent of unresolved family regrets that have simmered for generations among hardworking folks like us who know the weight of land and legacy all too well. And there I sat. Emily Harper, a 45-year-old widow who'd spent the better part of her life tending to the family farm through endless seasons of drought and fleeting prosperity, feeling the tension coil tighter as my older brother Jack, 3 years my senior and always the one to chase bigger horizons beyond the cornfields, burst into that triumphant laughter echoing off the paneled walls like he'd just been handed the keys to some grand American dream while I was left clutching the remnants of our shared past. He leaned forward in his polished leather chair, the kind that screamed corporate success from his Des Moines high-rise lifestyle, his tailored suit a stark contrast to my simple blouse and jeans still dusted with the morning's chores from feeding the livestock back home, and with a smug grin stretching across his face he declared in that booming voice of his, "You got the farm? I got the empire. Looks like you're destined to keep mucking through the stalls while I steer the whole operation into the future, little sis, just like Dad always intended for the one who could handle real power." I held my tongue in that moment, my stomach churning with a volatile mix of resentment and disbelief, because deep down I'd long suspected our father had tilted the scales in Jack's favor ever since he abandoned the dirt roads for boardrooms and big deals, leaving me to shoulder the quiet burdens of maintaining the 200-acre spread that had been the Harper anchor since my grandparents first broke the sod in the early 20th century. Yet, even as his words stung like salt in an old wound, I couldn't help but sense the undercurrent of something more layered beneath the surface, a hidden dynamic that might upend his premature victory parade. Mr. Elias Grant, the family lawyer who'd handled Dad's affairs for over 30 years with his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually perched on the edge of his nose and a demeanor that blended folksy wisdom with professional caution, cleared his throat softly before adjusting those glasses once more and proceeding to read the next clause from the will in his deliberate, measured tone that carried the weight of legal finality across the room. "The empire, however, exists on land owned by the farm," he stated plainly, his words landing like a thunderclap in the midst of Jack's glee, causing my brother's face to drain of every last bit of color as he snapped upright, his eyes widening in a flicker of raw panic while darting frantically between the document in Elias's hands and my own composed expression, transforming what had been a moment of his unchallenged dominance into one of precarious vulnerability that hung palpably in the air between us. The silence that followed stretched out uncomfortably, broken only by the steady tick of the antique clock mounted on the far wall, a relic from Dad's own youth that now seemed to mock the fragility of the fortunes we'd all assumed were set in stone. And in that suspended instant, I felt a spark of something akin to vindication ignite within me, not outright joy, but a subtle thrill at witnessing the first crack in the facade of Jack's self-assured world, especially since I'd overheard whispers from Elias during probate preparations about overlapping deeds and easement complications that Dad had navigated with the cunning of a man who'd seen too many economic storms ravage the Midwest. As Elias concluded the reading with procedural details about upcoming meetings, tax implications, and the distribution of smaller assets like the old family cabin up north that we'd shared childhood vacations in, he distributed thick folders to each of us containing copies of the will, property surveys, and financial summaries that promised to unravel further intricacies once we delved deeper. But even as we rose to leave the office and stepped out into the crisp autumn breeze carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves from the nearby park, Jack shot me a sidelong glare laced with unspoken threats that conveyed this inheritance revelation was far from the end of our sibling standoff. Driving back to the farm in my reliable but weathered pickup truck, the gravel road crunching rhythmically under the tires as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling fields that had defined so much of my existence since Mom's passing a decade earlier, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind, particularly Dad's parting words embedded in the will about the land representing the true foundation of any lasting enterprise rather than the flashy structures built upon it, a philosophy he drilled into us during those long evenings around the kitchen table discussing crop yields and market fluctuations. That night, as I settled into the familiar creaks and groans of the old farmhouse with its wallpaper peeling slightly at the edges from years of humid summers and the constant hum of the refrigerator providing a solitary backdrop to my thoughts, I finally opened my assigned folder on the scarred oak table where Dad used to balance ledgers by lamplight, and tucked within its pages I discovered a sealed envelope bearing his familiar, slightly unsteady handwriting from his final months, addressed solely to me in a way that immediately set my pulse racing with a blend of curiosity and apprehension. With fingers that betrayed a subtle tremble from the emotional residue of the day, I carefully tore open the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside, revealing just a handful of lines scrawled in his characteristic script that read, "Emily, the farm isn't merely a patch of earth to till. It's the linchpin holding everything together, so guard it fiercely and keep a sharp eye on Jack because certain old obligations from our past have a way of resurfacing when least expected, potentially pulling the entire structure down if not handled with care." Those words lingered with me long into the night, stirring a whirlwind of questions about the nature of those alluded to debts and why Dad had chosen to conceal such critical information in this cryptic manner rather than addressing it openly before his health declined so rapidly, leaving me to ponder alone under the dim glow of the bedside lamp whether this was his ultimate act of balancing the scales between his children or merely the opening gambit in a larger game of family intrigue that could ensnare us all in unforeseen consequences. That sealed envelope from Dad with its ominous warning about hidden obligations and the farm serving as the linchpin for our family's tangled fortunes kept replaying in my thoughts like a stubborn echo during those sleepless nights following the will reading, compelling me to climb up into the attic of the old farmhouse early the next morning where dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight filtering through the small window and the air carried the musty scent of forgotten trunks and yellowed ledgers that chronicled generations of Harper's struggles against the relentless cycles of planting and harvest in this unforgiving Iowa soil. Surrounded by those cobweb-draped boxes that held everything from my grandparents' marriage certificate to Dad's meticulously kept crop rotation notes spanning back to the mid-20th century, I methodically sifted through the paperwork, my hands growing grimy from the aged paper as patterns began to emerge showing how the farm's 200 acres had been carefully deeded in ways that intertwined with the very foundations of what Jack now crowed about as his sprawling agribusiness empire, including overlapping boundaries for access roads and water rights that Dad had apparently secured during lean years when the family teetered on the edge of foreclosure after a brutal drought in the 1980s. Elias Grant's voice from our brief phone conversation the day before echoed in my mind as well. His cautious advice delivered in that gravelly tone honed from decades of mediating rural disputes to tread lightly around those easement complications from 20 years past because they involved not just family, but potential regulatory headaches that could ripple through the county's entire agricultural network, yet his reluctance only fueled my determination to press further until he relented with a sigh and directed me toward the county clerk's office for official surveys that might illuminate the full extent of the land's leverage in this unexpected inheritance standoff. Meanwhile, Jack wasted no time asserting his perceived dominance by rolling up to the farm in his gleaming black SUV just 2 days later, the engine's low rumble announcing his arrival like an unwelcome intruder across the quiet fields where I'd been repairing a section of irrigation pipe under the warming sun. And he stepped out flanked by a sharp-suited lawyer Trent who exuded the kind of big-city polish that made my practical denim overalls feel even more out of place in this escalating family drama. Leaning casually against the weathered fence post, as if we were merely haggling over fence lines like back in our teenage years when he'd shirk chores to sneak off to town, Jack flashed that trademark grin laced with condescension and launched into his pitch for me to sign over perpetual access rights to the farm's roads and fields so his fleet of delivery trucks could continue hauling fertilizer and equipment without the pesky interruptions of legal boundaries, framing it all as a noble gesture to sustain the jobs his empire provided for so many neighbors who'd come to rely on its steady payroll since Dad first expanded the operation from a modest feed mill into a regional powerhouse. I swallowed a sharp retort, bubbling up about how his noble empire had been sucking resources from the farm for years without a fair shake in return, instead inviting them inside for a pot of strong coffee brewed on the old percolator that Dad swore by for clearing heads during tough talks, using the time to stall with anecdotes about the property's history, including the ancient oak tree out front that had survived tornadoes and now shaded the very drive Jack wanted unrestricted use of, all while my mind raced ahead to the subtle ways I could turn the tables without tipping my hand too soon. Once they departed empty-handed after an hour of fruitless negotiation, their SUV kicking up dust on the gravel lane as they headed back toward the highway, I set about crafting my initial stroke of revenge by reaching out to an old high school acquaintance who now worked as a reporter for the local paper, discreetly passing along a well-timed rumor I'd pieced together from overheard conversations at the county co-op about Jack's company cutting corners on employee safety protocols during warehouse expansions. Nothing fabricated, but just enough juicy detail to spark an investigative piece that aired on the evening news cycle and sent ripples through his investor circle with headlines questioning the stability of Harper Agritech's growth model. The satisfaction washed over me the next morning as I sipped my coffee on the porch swing, watching Jack's vehicle slow at the gate for a furious glare in my direction, while his phone visibly buzzed with incoming calls from rattled stakeholders. That witty little leak serving as a reminder that even empires built on bluster could wobble under the pressure of public scrutiny without me ever raising my voice above a neighborly chat. Emboldened by this small victory, yet mindful of the larger puzzle Dad's note had hinted at, I made the drive to the county clerk's office that same afternoon, navigating the familiar route through patchwork fields golden with late-season corn and arriving at the squat brick building where clerks bustled behind counters stacked with plat maps and deed books that smelled of ink and bureaucracy, spending hours poring over the official records that confirmed the farm's boundaries encroached upon. Key parcels underpinning Jack's operations, including a crucial access corridor deeded exclusively to our property in the 1970s when Dad outmaneuvered a rival buyer during a heated auction. As I captured discreet photographs of the most damning documents on my phone with a steady hand despite the knot of anticipation tightening in my chest, the weight of potential leverage settling in like the first chill of approaching winter, my cell suddenly vibrated with an incoming call from an unrecognized number, displaying a Des Moines area code that sent a prickle of unease down my spine. Answering cautiously in the quiet hallway away from prying ears, I heard a gravelly male voice on the other end, low and laced with warning, state without preamble, "You'd be wise to leave those records alone, Miss Harper. Because some people in your brother's circle have long memories and short fuses when it comes to unearthing history they'd prefer stayed buried deep in the files." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing there with the phone clutched tightly as the clerk's office door swung open behind me, the sun now dipping lower toward the horizon and casting elongated shadows across the parking lot. A chilling realization dawning that this anonymous threat might not stem from Jack alone, but from deeper entanglements tied to those elusive debts Dad had alluded to, forcing me to hurry back to the truck with my discoveries in hand. While glancing over my shoulder at the empty street, wondering just how far the shadows of our family's past extended into the present conflict that now felt far more personal and perilous than any sibling rivalry. The anonymous phone call with its gravelly warning about long memories and short fuses lingered in my ears like an unwelcome shadow as I navigated the winding country roads back to the farm that evening, the headlights of my pickup cutting through the gathering dusk while my mind raced with possibilities about who might be pulling strings from the fringes of Jack's corporate web to keep those buried histories firmly under wraps, prompting me to decide that confronting this alone felt too isolating amid the vast isolation of the Iowa countryside, so I reached out to our cousin Lila Monroe, the one relative who'd always navigated family waters with a mix of opportunism and insight that bordered on ruthless after she traded her own inherited plot of land for a bustling real estate career in Des Moines where she flipped properties for clients. chasing the American dream of upward mobility. We arranged to meet at a nondescript roadside diner perched on the outskirts of town the very next day. The kind of place with faded red booths scarred from decades of farmers hashing out crop prices over plates of hash browns and bottomless coffee that steamed in the chill air seeping through the door every time a trucker pushed inside. And as Lila slid into the seat opposite me with her perfectly coiffed hair and sharp blazer that screamed urban ambition, she eyed my dirt-streaked jeans with a raised eyebrow before ordering her usual black coffee, stirring it methodically as I unfolded the tale of the Will's twist along with Dad's cryptic envelope and the unsettling call that had me glancing over my shoulder ever since. She listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to a sly recognition as she connected threads I'd overlooked during her own dealings with Jack's expansion projects a few years prior, revealing how she'd facilitated some innovative land acquisitions for his warehouses that danced around zoning laws and environmental regs in ways that now cast a suspicious light on the empire's seemingly solid foundations, whispering across the table that his whole operation might be propped up on a foundation of sand if the right documents surfaced to expose those creative shortcuts. Those confessions stirred a flood of flashbacks to our shared childhood on the farm where Jack and I grew up under Dad's watchful eye amid the scent of fresh-turned earth and the distant lowing of cattle. Memories of him always emerging as the favored one with a shiny new bicycle for his birthday, while I made do with hand-me-downs and the task of mending the barbed wire fences that kept our world contained. Or the tense summer when Dad bailed Jack out of a scrape with the law after a reckless joyride in the old Ford that ended in a ditch, but handed me a month's grounding for merely being late home from a school event. Resentments that had simmered quietly over the years now boiling to the surface and sharpening my resolve to unearth the truth even as they made me pause and wonder if this quest for justice was worth dredging up pains that could fracture the already tenuous bonds of blood tying us together. Lila, ever the pragmatist with her real estate savvy honed from navigating foreclosures and boom markets alike, agreed to leverage her network of contacts in the legal and development circles to dig into those old debts Dad had hinted at, but not without extracting a quid pro quo in the form of my assistance on a pending sale for a neighboring property where she needed a credible local endorsement to sway a hesitant buyer, a favor I granted reluctantly by vouching for the land's stability. During a joint walkthrough, despite knowing full well about its occasional flooding issues from heavy spring rains, a moral bend that left me with a bitter aftertaste, as if I'd dipped a toe into the same murky waters Jack swam in daily. Jack escalated the pressure shortly thereafter by serving me with formal papers for a lawsuit claiming adverse possession over portions of the farm's access road, the documents arriving via certified mail while I was out in the fields overseeing the harvest crew as combines rumbled through the standing corn turning golden stalks into silage for winter feed. The legal jargon outlining his argument that years of his company's use had entitled them to ownership and threatening to tie up my operations in court battles that could drain the farm's already slim resources before the first frost. In response to this bold overreach that smacked of the same entitled maneuvering he'd employed since we were kids fighting over the last slice of pie at family gatherings, I coordinated a clever counterstrike with Lila's inside information by anonymously alerting the county health department to a trivial but inspectable violation in the cafeteria setup at one of Jack's flagship processing plants. A minor oversight on ventilation filters that she had spotted during a recent open house tour, ensuring the inspection coincided with a high-profile client visit from a major distributor and resulting in a temporary shutdown that splashed across the local headlines as Empire's kitchen in hot water. Much to my private amusement as I imagined Jack's face turning the shade of overripe tomatoes while he scrambled to reschedule and salvage his reputation. That satisfying twist of fate provided a momentary lift in spirits. Watching from the safety of my kitchen as evening news reports detailed the disruption to his polished operations and forced apologies to investors who prized reliability above all in the cutthroat world of agribusiness. Yet the deeper dilemma surfaced when Lila phoned me late that same night, her voice hushed and urgent over the crackling line as if she feared being overheard in her downtown apartment. She revealed preliminary findings from a retired paralegal friend who'd combed through archived loan records, uncovering evidence that Dad had co-signed a substantial startup loan for Jack's initial venture using the farm as collateral back in the early 2000s, but with irregularities suggesting possible forgeries on the paperwork that tied directly into the anonymous caller's circle, potentially involving underhanded dealings with suppliers or even local officials who'd looked the other way for a cut of the profits. As I paced the worn floorboards of the farmhouse with the wind howling outside against the window panes carrying the chill of impending winter storms, my blood turning to ice at the implications of this brewing scandal that could not only undermine Jack's empire, but taint the Harper name across the community we'd helped build, I grappled with the wrenching choice of whether to press forward and expose it all, risking a media frenzy that swallowed us whole, or pull back and preserve some semblance of family unity at the cost of letting Jack's encroachments continue unchecked, a tension that left me staring into the darkness wondering if the ghosts of Dad's decisions would ultimately drag us all into the abyss or forge a path to the reckoning we so desperately needed. Lila's late-night disclosure about the forged loan documents and the shadowy figures potentially circling from Dad's co-signing era weighed on me heavily through the following days as I mulled over the ethical tightrope of exposing such explosive material that could not only dismantle Jack's carefully constructed empire, but also drag the entire Harper legacy through the mud of public scandal in a community where reputations were as intertwined with the land as the roots of the cornstalks stretching across our shared horizon, ultimately leading me to schedule what I framed as a mediation session at the gleaming headquarters of Harper Agritech on the bustling outskirts of Des Moines, where the modern architecture of glass walls and steel beams stood in stark opposition to the sturdy timber barns of our family farm that had weathered blizzards and economic downturns with unyielding resolve. Elias Grant insisted on accompanying me for this pivotal encounter, his weathered briefcase bulging with annotated copies of the surveys and deeds we'd gathered so far as we navigated the security checkpoint and rode the elevator up to the executive floor where the air hummed with the soft whir of air conditioning and the faint scent of expensive cologne, mingled with fresh brewed espresso from the break room, a far cry from the earthy aromas of manure and machine oil that define my daily routine back home. Jack greeted us in the expansive conference room overlooking the sprawling industrial park that his operations dominated, playing the role of affable host by gesturing toward ergonomic chairs and offering chilled bottles of spring water, while his entourage of advisors, including the ever-present Trent, hovered at the edges with laptops at the ready to project revenue charts that painted his agribusiness as an unstoppable force sustaining livelihoods from farmhands to Fortune 500 suppliers across the Midwest. The atmosphere crackled with underlying tension as Elias unrolled the oversized plat maps across the polished mahogany table, methodically tracing the lines that demonstrated how Jack's warehouses and processing facilities encroached upon farm-owned parcels without valid long-term leases or proper easements established decades ago, when Dad had shrewdly retained control during the initial expansions to prevent overreach from swallowing the core property whole, a revelation that prompted Jack to lean forward with feigned incredulity, his face flushing beneath the fluorescent lights as he countered that such technicalities were mere oversights from Dad's era and surely intended for the greater good of the family enterprise he'd built from the ground up. The discussion devolved into a heated exchange of barbs that unearthed long-buried grievances from our youth, including how Jack had skipped Mom's funeral to seal a lucrative contract in Chicago, leaving me to arrange the somber details alone amid the condolences of neighbors who'd known her as the heart of the farm, or the way he'd siphoned funds from our joint college savings for his entrepreneurial schemes without a backward glance, while I scrimped through community college on scholarships and part-time shifts at the local feed store. Emotions that left me seething internally, yet choosing the path of calculated restraint over an all-out verbal assault that might have felt cathartic, but could have jeopardized the strategic advantage I held in this high-stakes negotiation, opting instead for a riskier maneuver that blurred the lines between justice and opportunism, I discreetly passed an encrypted USB drive to one of Jack's mid-level executives during a brief hallway break. The man, a former classmate of Lila's who'd confided in her about growing disillusionment with the company's aggressive tactics, loaded with redacted public records and whistleblower tips hinting at the easement frauds without directly implicating the farm's involvement, knowing full well that if it leaked through anonymous channels, it could trigger regulatory scrutiny powerful enough to erode investor confidence overnight. The revenge unfolded spectacularly just 3 days later, when a prominent industry blog broke the story of Harper Agritech's hidden land grabs, complete with diagrams mirroring the ones Elias had presented and quotes from unnamed insiders decrying the ethical lapses that had ballooned the empire at the expense of smallholders like myself. The fallout hitting Jack like a freight train as his stock dipped sharply and a key distribution deal with a national chain fell through amid the bad press, forcing him to issue a fumbling press release from his office that I caught on the radio while driving to town for supplies, chuckling to myself at the irony of his polished persona cracking under the weight of truths he'd long dismissed as inconsequential. That clever public humiliation provided a surge of satisfaction akin to finally balancing the scales after years of being the overlooked sibling in Dad's shadow, yet it came laced with fresh dilemmas as I returned to the farmhouse that evening and pried open the heavy safe bolted behind a false panel in the study, a relic from Dad's paranoid days during the farm crisis of the 1980s. Where I unearthed a bundle of faded correspondence from our long-deceased Uncle Harlan, who'd migrated west during the Dust Bowl, only to circle back with claims of stolen acres redrawn in hasty post-war surveys to consolidate family holdings, but potentially invalidating portions of the current boundaries if challenged in court. Elias pored over the letters with me the next morning over mugs of steaming tea on the sunlit porch, confirming that surfacing these could unravel the probate entirely and grant the farm unprecedented leverage over subsurface rights, including mineral explorations Jack's team had eyed for expansion, but pursuing validation required consulting a specialized surveyor known in discreet circles for uncovering buried advantages, often through methods that skirted the edges of propriety, a choice that gnawed at my conscience as I weighed the temptation of hiring him against the risk of descending into the same moral gray areas Jack inhabited so comfortably. With Jack's desperation mounting, as evidenced by his sudden voicemail offering to buy out my share at double the appraised value, a gesture reeking of panic rather than generosity, I committed to the shady alliance, texting the surveyor's contact Lila had provided and arranging a covert meeting for the following week, even as second thoughts plagued me about whether this path made me complicit in the very deceptions I sought to avenge. As the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that mirrored the turbulent emotions churning within, I received an urgent message from the surveyor himself detailing his initial reconnaissance and promising revelations that could redefine the land's value entirely, but warning of complications tied to those old Harlan letters that might implicate family members in ways I hadn't anticipated, leaving me to stare at the glowing screen in the dim kitchen light, heart pounding with a volatile mix of anticipation and dread over the personal toll this escalating revenge might exact before the final cards were played. The surveyor's urgent message about complications tied to Uncle Harlan's faded letters and the potential for redefining the farm's boundaries in ways that could upend decades of established claims propelled me into action, despite the gnawing uncertainty swirling in my gut like the first flurries of an Iowa winter storm brewing on the horizon, leading me to arrange our clandestine meeting in the dimly lit backroom of the county archives building, where stacks of forgotten file cabinets loomed like silent sentinels guarding secrets from the post-war era, when families like ours scrambled to redraw lines on maps amid the chaos of returning soldiers and economic rebirth. He arrived promptly with a battered leather satchel slung over his shoulder, his face etched with the lines of a man who'd spent years unearthing buried truths for clients ranging from feuding heirs to corporate land grabbers. And as he unrolled the annotated blueprints across a cluttered work table under the harsh glow of a single desk lamp, the intricate web of revisions from 1952 came into sharp focus, revealing how Dad had ingeniously retained subsurface rights beneath the farm's acreage, including mineral and drilling access that extended under Jack's empire. Facilities a hidden clause designed to counterbalance the surface expansions and protect against the very overreaches that had now come home to roost. Elias joined us via a hurried conference call from his office, patching in his expertise on probate law to confirm the ironclad nature of these provisions, which granted me unilateral veto power over any underground developments Jack's team might pursue. For resource extraction or infrastructure upgrades, a bombshell revelation that tied directly into those elusive debts Dad had warned about stemming from Uncle Harlan's gambling woes in the 40s when he'd pawned family plots only for Dad to quietly reclaim them through shrewd legal maneuvers, ensuring the farm's foundational strength endured even as the empire rose atop its unseen pillars. Piecing together the full puzzle over the next 48 hours in frantic sessions at the farmhouse kitchen table surrounded by coffee stains and scribbled notes that mapped out the leverage like a battle plan from one of those old westerns Dad loved watching on lazy Sunday afternoons, I realized this wasn't mere favoritism, but Dad's calculated final act to force accountability between his children, compelling Jack to confront the fragility of his achievements built on foundations he hadn't fully earned or acknowledged. With this arsenal in hand, the uncertainty that had plagued me since the will reading crystallized into resolve, prompting me to lure Jack to the farm under the pretense of discussing his doubled buyout offer, his SUV crunching over the gravel drive on a gray afternoon heavy with the scent of impending rain as thunder rumbled distantly across the fields that had witnessed our every milestone from childhood escapades to adult reckonings. He stepped out with Trent trailing behind like a reluctant shadow, his posture exuding a mix of bravado and barely concealed desperation as he proposed terms laced with promises of financial security for my modest lifestyle while downplaying the empire's reliance on the very land he sought to sever from my grasp. But I cut through his sales pitch with the unvarnished truth, laying out the subsurface veto in explicit detail, watching his confident facade crumble into pallor as the reality sank in. That one signature from me could halt his drilling projects and expansion bids, indefinitely unraveling the profit margins he'd boasted about in boardrooms and press releases. The confrontation unfolded with raw honesty, dredging up the laughter from Elias's office that had ignited this fire, and the years of slights, where he'd treated the farm like a mere footnote to his grand narrative, prompting a tense back and forth that unearthed vulnerabilities on both sides, including his quiet admissions of guilt over Mom's funeral absence driven by fear of failing Dad's expectations, a confession that humanized him just enough to stir a flicker of empathy amid my simmering resentment. Humor crept in unexpectedly when I quipped about his so-called kingdom resembling more of a flashy sandcastle teetering on the edge of high tide, ready to wash away with the next legal wave, drawing a strained chuckle even from Trent, who shifted uncomfortably in his loafers as if witnessing the unmasking of his boss's bluster for the first time, and the light vulgarity of the moment hit when Jack grumbled about Dad's penchant for playing puppet master with his dirt-bound little domain, underscoring the petty undercurrents of our rivalry that had festered like an untreated wound over too many family holidays. My ultimate revenge manifested not in outright destruction, but in a clever pivot, refusing the buyout cold and countering with a proposal for a joint venture where the farm retained veto oversight and a percentage of subsurface revenues, ensuring the empire's survival hinged on equitable partnership rather than domination, a satisfying maneuver that forced Jack to the negotiating table on my terms, his initial resistance giving way to reluctant nods as the rain finally broke, pattering against the farmhouse windows like applause for the shift in power dynamics. In those closing minutes, as Elias finalized the preliminary agreement over speakerphone, confirming the land's leverage as unassailable and toppling the last illusions of Jack's unchallenged reign, the major truths emerged, tying back to the will reading's twist, where Dad's words about the empire existing on farm-owned land proved far more profound than surface boundaries alone, encompassing the hidden depths that had always been the true source of Harper's strength. Yet, even as handshakes sealed the tentative truce, doubts lingered thick in the air like the post-rain humidity clinging to the fields outside. Had I chosen wisely by opting for collaboration over courtroom annihilation, sparing the family business from collapse, but potentially enabling Jack's ingrained flaws to persist unchecked, or was this merely a bandage on a deeper fracture that time and ambition might tear open anew? driving the surveyor away later with a discreet envelope of compensation tucked under his arm as the sun pierced through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the acres that now felt irrevocably intertwined with the Empire's fate. I stood on the porch in the fading light, reflecting on the path we'd traversed from stunned silence in Elias's office to this ambiguous victory, pondering whether Dad's legacy ultimately fostered forgiveness through enforced interdependence or sowed seeds for future discord, and inviting anyone who's ever navigated the treacherous waters of family inheritance to consider what they might sacrifice when dirt turns to disputed gold in the balance of blood ties and buried ambitions.